The strange thing about fertilizer is that most people only notice it when food prices rise. Nobody really thinks about ammonia pipelines or urea shipments when buying bread or rice or maize meal. But modern agriculture depends heavily on hydrocarbon based fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizer especially. And nitrogen fertilizer depends on natural gas. That connection means that food systems are now tied directly to energy systems. So when energy markets become unstable, fertilizer markets usually follow right behind them. Not immediately sometimes, but eventually they do. That is partly what the Sahel is dealing with right now. A 15% shortfall in fertilizer inputs may sound technical on paper, and maybe it even sounds manageable, but agriculture works on timing. Missing fertilizer during planting season is not like your Shein or Amazon delivery delaying shipping. Crops either receive nutrients during critical growth windows or yields decline. There is no quick correction later. The Sahel reportedly already operates close to environmental and economic limits in many places with dramatic rainfall variability. So, fragile logistics, conflict zones, weak road systems, import dependency, and so on and so forth, and things of that nature. So, a fertilizer disruption enters an already stressed system. Then, food prices rise. Then, governments increase subsidies or emergency imports if they cannot afford it. The families have to reduce consumption at the end of the day. Farmers plant less acreage because input costs become too high. And eventually, political pressure builds because food inflation is one of the fastest ways to destabilize public trust. You saw versions of this during the Arab Spring years ago. Food systems and political systems are closely connected, whether governments admit it openly or not. The FAO warning about more than 52 million people facing acute food insecurity across West Africa and the Sahel during the 2026 lean season is not only about agriculture, it is about state stability too. Once enough people cannot reliably afford staple food, every other political issue becomes harder to manage. What's changed globally is that governments are no longer pretending markets alone will solve these shortages. That era is fading. Maybe not completely, but it is enough to notice. Egypt imposing a temporary export tax on nitrogen fertilizer earlier in May is one example. Australia creating a fuel and fertilizer security facility with billions is another one. These decisions tell you something important about how states now think. Fertilizer is no longer treated as just another commodity floating around global markets. It is increasingly viewed as strategic infrastructure, almost like energy reserves or military supply chains, even. Governments are intervening because they know that shortages create domestic political risk. If fertilizer becomes unaffordable, food prices rise. If food prices rise long enough, governments lose their legitimacy. Pretty simple chain reaction, actually. The uncomfortable part is that when wealthy countries intervene to protect their own supply, poor import dependent regions usually absorb the damage. That's partly why fertilizer prices climbed so sharply after the Russia Ukraine campaign disrupted energy and commodity markets. Natural gas prices surged, sanctions complicated trade routes, shipping insurance costs then increased, and then countries began prioritizing domestic stockpiles instead of export flows. So even when fertilizer technically existed somewhere in the world, access became harder for countries without strong purchasing power or strategic leverage. A country like Australia can inject billions into securing domestic inputs. Egypt can tax exports temporarily to stabilize its internal markets, but countries already struggling with debt or foreign currency shortages cannot compete as aggressively. They enter bidding wars they were never financially designed to win. And this is where the Emergency Fertilizer Task Force becomes more interesting than it first sounds. because it's not really just an agricultural committee. It is a survival mechanism forming inside a fragmented global system. The old assumption used to be that global trade networks would keep critical goods flowing efficiently across borders. Cheapest supplier wins. Market equilibrium eventually balances shortages in that situation. But by this year, governments increasingly distrust that logic during crisis. Shipping disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, instability in the Red Sea, sanctions networks, export restrictions, insurance spikes, all these things made just in time supply chains feel fragile. So regions started building backup systems, redundant systems with more local alliances, more stockpiling, less dependence on distant suppliers. And that's partly why Morocco's OCP group became strategically important to African food security conversations. Morocco controls enormous phosphate reserves, which are essential for fertilizer production. Suddenly, phosphate isn't just geology anymore. It became geopolitical leverage. And what is interesting is that African governments are slowly beginning to recognize that resource coordination matters more than ideological speeches. South South procurement discussions inside the Sahel reflect that shift. Instead of waiting for traditional Western institutions or volatile commodity markets to stabilize things, regional actors are trying to build more direct supply relationships across Africa and parts of the global south. Slowly and evenly, but still, the logic is practical. If fertilizer shortages threaten state stability, then securing fertilizer becomes part of national security policy. Same with water infrastructure, same with grain reserves, same with energy access. There's also a behavioral change happening inside governments themselves. States are acting less like neutral regulators and more like strategic competitors. You can see it across food systems, energy systems, semiconductor markets, and also shipping corridors. Officials now openly discuss resilience, stockpiles, redundancy, sovereign capacity. Those words appear constantly in policy documents around over the last few years, and honestly, it makes sense from that perspective. Leaders watched COVID disrupt shipping. They watched sanctions reshape commodity flows. They watched wars affect fertilizer exports and fuel prices simultaneously. So governments learned that dependence can become vulnerability very quickly, especially for countries without strong domestic production capacity. The Sahel's fertilizer crisis exposes this problem clearly because agriculture there depends heavily on external hydrocarbon linked inputs, while local populations remain extremely sensitive to price shocks. That combination creates structural fragility. And underneath all of this sits the broader systems issue that governments rarely explain directly to ordinary people. Food security is no longer about farming skill or rainfall patterns. It depends on shipping access, energy networks, foreign exchange reserves, diplomatic relationships, mineral control, industrial processing, and logistical coordination across entire regions. The countries and blocs gaining influence now are usually the ones capable of securing these interconnected systems consistently under pressure. Not necessarily perfectly, just reliably enough to maintain order when disruptions happen. Fertilizer shortages in the Sahel are one example of that larger shift. Whoever controls the hydrocarbon to nutrient pipeline, the shipping insurance systems, the port infrastructure, the mineral processing chains, and the financing networks ends up shaping political outcomes far beyond agriculture itself. Over time, power starts accumulating around those systems. Then eventually, governments realize they are no longer competing only over territory or ideology. They are competing over who can keep basic life functioning when global networks stop behaving predictably.